We're now going to have time for questions and discussion. If anyone has a question for any or all of our panel members, there is a roaming mic, so if you just raise your hand, please.
Hi, I have two questions. The first one is for Colm. You talked at one point in time about the influence that Irish Home Rule had on the Victorian Constitution. You specifically put it in the context of the development of British ideas of popular sovereignty. Actually, I just wonder, is there a kind of a mirror image that occurs then in Ireland, that in a sense the debates that there were about the people's budget and the eventual kind of a restriction of the power of the House of Lords, did that have any effect, or maybe you know, maybe you don't, but did that have any effect on Irish ideas of what was possible, the vista changes in relation to popular sovereignty here as a result of that? And the second one is for Owen. It's a question in relation to, you said at one point in time that Ireland was something of an outlier in relation to judicial review. I wasn't quite clear if you meant judicial review of fundamental rights in 1922, or if you just meant judicial review, because you used the example of the UK, but then you specifically referenced the 1960s. But a judicial review, certainly within the Commonwealth, was completely established at that point in time. It's just judicial review of fundamental rights is not. So they would judicially review whether or not, like the Commonwealth, the Dominions didn't have extraterritorial jurisdiction. You didn't have the ability to limit the appeal to the Privy Council, and if you tried to do that, they would strike that down. So judicial review itself wasn't a problem from a conceptual point of view. It was more fundamental rights. So that may indeed have been what you meant because of the 1960s example, but I just wanted to ask you about that.
I mean, very briefly, just the distinction I was getting at about the sort of shift in the UK constitutional imagination. In 1916 and subsequently, you see in the constitutional rhetoric, and I'm just talking about the discourse now because I'm not a historian, but in the rhetoric you see it's framed as people versus crown. Now, if you see the debate in Scotland at the moment, it's not people versus crown, it's are we part of the same constituent people as the rest of the UK? So you see, that for me shows that that's just an illustration about how UK constitutional discourse has changed, where the old notion that the sort of people came to the crown, which was of course the historical reality, you had an established state structure that was gradually democratized very slowly. That has now given way to this, in a slightly confused, uncertain way, to the notion like everywhere else, power derives from the people, even if it's not very articulated very clearly. So that's what's happened in the UK. I'm not certain about, I wouldn't say this is necessarily a big Irish influence, frankly probably not, but it reflects the general embrace, despite Owen's qualms about the idea of popular sovereignty as a central organising principle in almost any constitutional system. Even in China to this day, if you look at the constitutional rhetoric of the Communist Party, it's we are the chosen, we are the guardians of the people in bringing forward China. It's even to that extent where an avowedly Marxist state sort of invokes popular sovereignty. So it's gone global, so to speak.
Yeah, thanks, Donald. You're right. I should clarify that, of course, there are some kinds of judicial review in Commonwealth countries that don't quite necessarily maintain the same model of parliamentary supremacy or legislative supremacy that you have in the UK. I suppose you have the same scepticism towards rights, towards amorphous concepts of rights, as judicial checks on legislative power that is taken from British constitutional culture. But it's interesting to ask in what sense Ireland's embrace of rights-based judicial review is anomalous. I hate that word, anomalous, at different points. And it's possibly more interesting to ask that in European and Western European terms than it is in relation to the Commonwealth world. In 1922, as far as I'm aware, the only antecedents in Europe are relatively experimental, abortive systems of, well, constitutional court systems in Austria and Czechoslovakia, possibly in the interwar period, which were inspired by Kelsen and never really took life. Well, I don't know much about them, so I won't even go as far to say that. And then in 1937, the embrace of rights, the more enthusiastic embrace of rights-based judicial review is anomalous. Is very much anomalous in European terms because those institutions don't develop until after the Second World War, and arguably much later on, even in Western Europe. In France, for example, rights-based judicial review doesn't really start until the 70s at least. I know it starts earlier in Germany for obvious reasons. And of course, then you have a new wave of constitutional courts in the 90s with the fall of the Iron Curtain. So maybe, I mean, I mentioned Ireland being anomalous as a seceding country, but maybe it's more useful to talk about it as being anomalous in European terms, actually.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions?
Billy McGuire is my name, and I'm president of the Irish and Fenian Republican Brotherhood. You didn't mention those here today, and it was we founded the state, the Sovereign Republic of Éire, the Sovereign Republican Dáil Éireann government, and the Sovereign Dáil Éireann courts. That's our tricolour flag that we put up on the GPO in 1916, taken down by Diarmaid Lynch, and ratified by the will of all the people in the 1918 32 county election from GHQ, Vaughan's Hotel, and from the Mansion House, Dublin, and with the green nearest to the pole. And I think it's important too, you mentioned sovereignty. We hold the sovereignty and the legitimacy of the state. We're not a political party or anything like that, but that's the mandate we got of the 1918 32 county election. And I think it's interesting that the Crown of England, the Crown is royalty, sovereignty is the harp. The Crown does not have sovereignty. It is the harp that is the sovereign. And Britain does not have a sovereign government. They have a royal government and royal courts of justice. And when they wanted to join the European Union, General de Gaulle wouldn't allow them because you have to have a sovereign government to be at the table in Europe. And it was our sovereignty and our sovereign government of the 21st of January 1919. And if you listen to David Cameron the other day, he said the British people will make a sovereign vote on the European Union. But of course, they're not sovereign, they're subject to the Crown. You can't be subject to the Crown and sovereign at the same time. And I think it's very important to understand that that is our sovereignty. And if you go back to 1155, you can trace it. You can go back to it's 2016, the sovereign seals and the harps, which weren't really mentioned today. I don't think that, you know, coming away from here, people have no understanding of sovereignty from this lecture, and everything is dependent on sovereignty. I think there's 119 sovereign states in the world at the moment, and we are probably one of the first of them. And I think we have a very proud, we are airbrushed out of everything. And I think you didn't mention the sovereign constitution. We have 5 constitutions in the state, and we have 5 governments in the state. There's only one sovereign government. That's by the will of all the people in the 1918 32 county election from GHQ, Vaughan's Hotel. And there's only one sovereign constitution, and that's by the will of the people. I have it here, and anybody can read it. And yet you never hear the judges talking about it. You never hear the courts talking about the sovereign constitution. And I think it's time in this, for the 100th anniversary, our 100th anniversary, that these things were brought out. The Irish and Fenian Republican Brotherhood, we weren't invited to one commemoration, and that's very odd. And if you saw Vaughan's Hotel in 29 Parnell Square and Granby Row, I've asked for 53 years to open up those tunnels and tell the truth about what happened in 1916. You can't understand 1916. It's about a sovereign government. And that sovereign government was the 21st of January 1919 by the will of all the people. You know, it's a shame that you, and I congratulate you for, you know, having a conference like this. You mentioned Bulmer Hobson, he's buried here, as you know, out in Roundstone. And I would have known Hayes McCoy, who did all the work on those, on the tricolour flag. As you know, when it was brought here, the orange was nearest to the pole. And it was adopted by James Stephens and John O'Mahony on St. Patrick's Day, 1858. That's the reason why we celebrate St. Patrick's Day. But these Irish people don't know these facts, and they don't know what's happening. Look at what's happening today. That sovereign government of the 21st of January is still legal, valid, and bona fides. And every 21st of January, we go to the Mansion House and reenact that government. And why are we talking today? A complete farce of a provisional government. If you look at it, nobody mentions Saoirse Éire today and what happened. when you said the treaty. There was never a treaty signed between Ireland and Britain. King George V on the 6th of December 1921 imposed a British apartheid system for the 26 and 6 counties of Ireland as an Orange-Free state and a provisional government. He annexed the 6 counties. That was in legal, valid or bona fides. The Crown's sovereignty today is from our harp, and it's up on you know that on their coat of arms. And she carries that and takes it very seriously. And I think there's a wonderful history there for Irish people, and it's a wonderful year that should be. We saw our tricolour being sent to all the schools and our proclamation, but no one ever talks about the sovereign constitution, and yet they won't explain it to the children. The difference between us and Britain is we are Celtic people. Ours is a Celtic Christianity where every child is born sovereign and has a sovereign right to the first 4 strings of the harp: earth, air, fire and water, man's intellect and reason and his 5 senses. Ours is Celtic Christianity, predates Roman Christianity, and you should understand the two of them, where every child is born with original sin and is a slave. And I think it's time that Ireland people stood up and understood the difference between the sovereign seals and harps. And I would thank you very much, and I would congratulate you for a wonderful conference.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Would anyone care to...
I suppose people can use the phrase or the term sovereignty in all sorts of conflicting ways, and all I would say is that I don't believe sovereignty, or let's say political rights or political legitimacy, I don't think it can be derived from a fixed historical point. I think it's probably an ongoing project as to whether it obtains consent and as to how it is exercised in an ongoing way. And so I think it's always probably arbitrary to try to pick a fixed point in the past at which a sovereign was established, because whatever about 1918, we could find alternative candidates as the point at which an Irish nation or an Irish sovereign or an Irish people was established, and that would always be contestable. But I suppose what is always in question is the ongoing conditions in which the power of any state is exercised to determine whether it's legitimate in an ongoing and not simply an historical way. That's all I would have to say about that.
Well, can I answer that? And the sovereignty comes from God, and the Constitution comes from man. That's the difference between the two. And it's on that. We read the page of that, and we declare the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland, and the unfettered control of Irish destiny to be sovereign and indefeasible. Nobody can change that. And if we do, it's treason, and it's treason under the oath in the Hearing Courts, which nobody mentions today. Having organised and prayed for amendment to a received revolutionary organisation, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the council who wrote that document, and yet you can say.
Colin, do you want to make a point?
There's lots there, but I'll come back to that. But I just wanted to sort of come back to what you said about the Crown and to use it as an excuse for, of course, pointing out something that I'm sure many of you have noticed, which is to say that Owen and I are in fundamental disagreement. In a really deeply, on a really, actually not, but anyway, on quite a fundamental issue, which I think is interesting just to sort of flag up, because it links to this. When you said that the sovereignty in the UK is located in the Crown, as we bore our first-year student, as I bore my UK, semi-UK, most of them aren't in the UK, first-year students, and sort of, its sovereignty in the UK is located in the Crown in Parliament. Okay, so it's a sort of, Right. There's a disagreement here. You'll just have to trust me on this. You'll have to trust me on this.
A crown on your head waving to your subjects. Sovereignty is a totally different thing. Sovereignty is about right. Sovereignty is from God, and that's where.
Okay. Well, right. Right. You'll just have to trust me on how the British perception of sovereignty is. And you see, that's interesting because sovereignty is located in the constituted organs of the state. Okay, the state, as I said, the constituted organs of state perpetually express the view of the British people. And there isn't a distinction between, if you want, a sort of background constitution that the people have given themselves and the functioning of the key organs of state, the Crown and Parliament. So when Owen says that this idea of sovereignty is really fuzzy and so on, which I agree with, he then implicitly, as I hear his argument, sort of begins to collapse the idea of democratic expression of the popular will into what happens in politics. I could be wrong on this, but the day-to-day, he started eliding the distinction, interestingly enough, between the democratic will and the will of the majority in his talk, right? So what he is saying there, interestingly enough, has echoes of what Richard Bellamy and others say discussing UK constitutional theory, which is that the will of the people is actually expressed through their political choices and through the political constituted organs of the state. And you can't really talk about this fuzzy idea of sovereignty separate from and distinct to the constitutional organs of the state. You see, and of course, what I'm saying is that sovereignty might be a fuzzy idea, but it's actually really important to maintain this distinction between popular sovereignty and how electoral processes give effect to particular governments, particular structure of the state, that there's an incredibly healthy tension there that stops what I see happening in the UK all the time, a collapse of the will of the people equals the functioning of the established organs of state, and a tendency there to sort of disregard the power relationships, the uncertainty, the messiness that happens there. I'll conclude by simply very briefly flagging up Scotland. It's only appropriate since we're discussing 1916. In Scotland, the argument is, actually, we have a different view of sovereignty. We see sovereignty as co-located in London and Edinburgh. That, it's the Scottish people have chosen to sort of remain opted in to the sovereign body of the UK and to use Westminster as their functioning organ of state, but we reserve the right, potentially, to withdraw from that. So the Scots are moving towards this sort of distinction between sovereignty and the constitutional organs of the state that I'm talking about. But Owen, I think, inevitably is sort of committed to some sort of collapsing of the concept of political will and sovereignty, which I question that because for all sorts of reasons as outlined in my talk. So I'm using your talk to sort of flag up the fact that we violently disagree.
I'm glad we do. The violence of the substance, not the method.
Exactly.
Okay, as we're running over time, I'm going to wrap it up now. I'm sorry. Okay, thank you.